Welcome to Scope Creep, the show that shines a light on what it's actually like to build a business, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm Jamie Cox.
And I'm Liz Talego, and we're both entrepreneurs in the business of building businesses. Every other week, we'll dissect the myths behind being a solopreneur, call out the celebrity entrepreneurs who push the passive income dream, and talk about the real benefits of being your own boss, from choosing how and when you spend your free time to building a career where you call the shots.
Let's take a #unfiltered look behind the proverbial curtain and learn how to build a values-based business where you're healthy and wealthy. No manifestation or vision boards required.
Welcome to the Season 1 finale of Scope Creep. Before we take a pause to gear up for Season 2, we decided to open our inboxes up to the Scope Creep community and let you guys decide what we should cover for today's show. Y'all did not disappoint, and this episode is jam-packed with listener insights, Scope Creep horror stories, and damn good questions from the freelance trenches.
And I know we normally do happy hour highs and lows, but Liz and I are sharing a high this week. We are riding the high of getting new and noteworthy on Apple Podcasts. So thank you so much for listening to this show. Yes. We love to have you. Liz, how did it feel to be acknowledged?
It was a pinch me moment for those of you that might not be Apple users, or if you are and you're just not aware. When you open up the Apple Podcast app on your phone, which comes preloaded if you have an iPhone, it's that little purple icon, and you click browse, one of the things you can easily peruse is a category called new and noteworthy. And that automatically shows up on anybody's iPhone that accesses the app in that way. And we are still featured in their new and noteworthy category. For a while, we were on the homepage. We are a top business podcast in the country, and we have been a top 10 entrepreneurship podcast in the country. So a little bit of a pinch me moment. I'm still like a little bit in shock, but also just really proud because we didn't cut corners. We didn't self-censor. We made that commitment to each other to come on this show and talk about hard things.
Yes.
And so it's been really cool to have that validated.
Yes. I love to know that there are a lot of haters out there who love listening to us hate on things.
Yeah, I will say that is kind of, maybe this is like the low from this high, is like getting all these eyeballs and like 10,000 downloads means we gained a lot of like kindred spirits, new fans, which is great. But we also, the 1-star Chads came out of the woodwork in mass, which is why we have been talking to you guys about the importance of leaving us a review if you love the show, to kind of drown those 1-star voices out. But yeah, being thrust into so many ears all across the world has been an interesting experience for sure.
Yes, it's been so fun. And just like meeting everybody too. People have been following us on TikTok and Instagram and messaging us like topic ideas, or just like, yeah, man, I hate the beige girlies. And I'm like, yeah, me too. So yeah, it's been really fun to be able to like connect to people, because right now it kind of feels like it's just you and I recording. We're speaking into the void. And so it's nice to know that this is going into your ears, dear sweet listener.
Yes. And knowing that there are not only people out there that love the same things that we do, but there are people out there who hate the same things that we do.
Yes, I love that. Camaraderie.
I say that somewhat facetiously, but honestly, just the reaction to the episode on Girl Boss Red Flags and how many people are so fed up with that shit. It's not just us, and it's just supremely validating to have that kind of response when you create something like this kind of from the heart.
Yes.
It's really cool.
Yes,
so,
I agree. So thank you everyone.
Yes.
It means so much. So speaking of our listeners, we've got some tea today to spill.
Yeah.
So Liz, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So we kind of opened up all of our inboxes in various places and asked you guys what you wanted us to talk about for the finale. What are your burning questions? And also share some of those Scope Creep horror stories with our listeners. And we were absolutely blown away by the response. We are going to do our very best to get through as many of them as we can today. But this has definitely motivated us to bring segments like this back for Season 2. So I want to kick things off. We're just going to read kind of verbatim the questions as they came in and give you guys a little bit of context about what they're about. And this first one is about client no-shows. This is something that I've experienced, and I was actually saying to Jamie a couple months ago, I've experienced this more so this past year than any other time in my freelance career, and it'll really mess with your head. So let's hear what this listener has to say, and we'll talk about her question. I've had a few potential clients no-show for initial meetings / discovery calls. I'm wondering what your experiences are with no-shows and what processes you have in place to mitigate this. Should I address it when it happens? And if so, how? This is so foreign to me because I would never no-show someone. Is it a sign that they're inconsiderate or are they simply disorganized? Either way, that's not the type of client I want, so I've started implementing a hard boundary for myself that if people no-show, I won't take them on as clients. I'm really curious about what your opinions are on this topic. Thanks in advance. Jamie, want to take a first stab?
I have had some interesting no-shows. Like people have paid me, like paid a deposit invoice, a significant deposit invoice, and then I had one client ghost me on not one, not two, but 3 scheduled discovery calls right in a row. I know. And I was like, I basically sent them an email afterward. And I was like, hey, you do realize you paid me this money. Like we signed a contract. So I've definitely had this experience. I have like small ones where people are like late or no show and they're kind of like, I rarely have a client that does it. I usually have like networking sort of calls when that happens. But yes, to speak to my experience, I have had client no-shows and I think it's bizarre as hell. Like, how are you running a business if you can't keep a calendar?
Right. If you can't keep your meetings.
Yes. Yeah. Have you had that happen?
So many times this past year. And like this listener, I've struggled because on the one hand, I'm like, are you just an asshole who doesn't value my time? Because if so, bye. Like, I don't want to work with you, obviously. Or are you just a busy, scattered founder, leader that is just having trouble keeping their head above water? And that's why you need me. Like, you need a partner. You need some support in your business. And so I try to have a little bit of grace with this. If it happens, usually, I have a 6-minute cutoff. If you're 6 minutes late, I sign off Zoom. I send an email that says something like, hey, I was just on our Zoom. It looks like our wires got crossed. If you would like to book again, here's my calendar link. And I leave it at that. And I do find that most people who blow me off don't rebook. And for me, I get the most blow offs when I'm offering some type of like lead gen freebie. So I'm trying to rethink that part of my business model right now. I recently did a whole bunch of like super quick in and out strategic messaging audits for founders and got a bunch of client work from it. It was really valuable for them. But I have learned this the hard way. And I think the saying is true. We pay attention to what we pay for. And that sounds like maybe it wasn't true for you with some client stuff, but I do think there's something to be said for at least having maybe a nominal fee for those initial meetings. And I'm going to be experimenting with that in the months ahead.
I like that. Yeah. The one person that no-showed me a few times, like the project ended up working out. We got through it. It was actually great, but it was like we had a really rocky start. And I think I was really clear with them after the second time that it would happened that I was like, listen, if you are going to cancel, you need to tell me because I've planned my entire day around this long phone call we're doing. Yeah. And so they were super like apologetic in that. They're like, I'm so sorry. Like they were dealing with some personal stuff and like, I get it. Life happens. And they were super apologetic and like, I promise I will be there the next time. And they were, and it was great. But it was just like, honestly being really real with them. If it's a paid client that you have a relationship with, you've already built this relationship with them and saying like, hey, these are the expectations that I have for these calls. I similarly have a cutoff time on my Zoom calls. Like if I get on there and nobody's in there at like 5 minutes, I'll send a quick note, like an email and just be like, hey, just a reminder, I'm on this call. And then if like 3 more minutes pass and they're not in there, then I'm like, okay, bye. Because, sometimes the time gets away from us. But I think one thing I found helpful with like prospective clients to kind of get a gauge on, are they just disorganized or are they an asshole? Is I like to ask people like, hey, what's going to be the most impactful way for me to communicate feedback with you? So I had one client who was like, he told me on the front end, he's like, listen, I have ADD and ADHD and I have a really hard time like focusing in on one thing. So like, I'm asking you for patience and to bear with me. And I was like, okay, what is the best way for me to get you back on track? And I think this is a similar scenario where if you're vetting a client, if they show up to the first call maybe, and you're trying to decide if you want to work with them, asking them like, hey, what's your schedule like? Is it, do you find yourself really busy? What days of the week are best for you to like be fully in a meeting and listening and engaging? Because we've also all been on meetings, which honestly, I'd rather somebody no show me when people are on a meeting and not paying attention.
Yeah.
So I think setting expectations on the front end is really good. And then also just kind of developing your own policy in your head of like, okay, this person no showed me once. I'll send a follow up. Maybe something happened. Something dramatic could have happened. I've heard of horror stories. But if they don't respond, just considering it like lost business, as long as you don't have a contract with them, obviously. And then if they do respond and then they do it to you again, they're probably an asshole.
Yeah, I would agree. Similarly, I think one boundary I've put in place for prospective clients and that discovery work, especially if it's unpaid, is I used to spend hours prepping for these calls because I wanted to be so prepared. And I've realized I want to be prepared enough with their business to be able to make the time valuable for them, but I'm not going to do hours of free work because then when they do no show you, it's just completely pissed away. So I do a little bit of research. I also have them fill out that pre-call questionnaire. So I make them give me the information I need to be helpful. And then for existing clients, I'm really specific in my contract about you get this many phone calls with me per period, week, month, whatever. They don't roll over. They're as needed. You can't cancel less than 24 hours before the scheduled meeting and then just roll it over. It's not the same every time, depending on whether it's an individual or an agency. But yeah, for existing clients, I have to have those boundaries around no showing as well, because it totally messes with workflow.
Yes. And I'll say too, I actually just hired somebody to do a photo shoot for me. And we were just talking and they were like, hey, listen, if you need to cancel, tell me a week ahead of time. And they just like put it in those terms. And it wasn't like I know you're going to cancel, because unless I'm dying, I would never.
Yeah.
But they were, but they had obviously been burned before that they felt the need to say that. And I was like, man, respect. So I think just setting those expectations ahead of time speaks volumes too about your work style and kind of sets the tone for the rest of the endeavor together.
And also try not to take it personally. It does feel, especially when you've prepared and you're excited, or maybe like you've, stalked them a little bit on LinkedIn and they look like somebody you'd want to work with, and you get all excited and then they just don't show you. You might feel like, oh my God, is it me? But I can tell you with every confidence that it is probably not you. It is probably something on their end.
Yes. Okay. Next question.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Cool. Okay. So this next question is about spec work. And if you work in any sort of creative industry, you're probably familiar with spec work, which is basically doing the work to make sure you're capable of doing the work without getting paid. So this person shares kind of a horror story, and we're going to talk about it. So they say, early in my career, I would ask for portfolio reviews as a way to start a conversation with ad agencies about contract work or full-time positions. Generally, it worked out okay. I met a few cool people this way, and it was a good learning experience and way to network when I didn't know anyone. One of the agencies I visited and wanted a job at asked me to do some quote-unquote homework. I said yes, because frankly, I was naive. They did not hire me, but definitely used my work almost word for word in a client campaign. This is more of a lesson learned for me, but for all the other young people out there, I'd love if you all could share some tips and advice for protecting your work in these types of situations and what to do if/when someone violates their professional relationship with you. Liz, have you ever? Yes.
Yes, because this exact same thing has happened to me, where early in my career, super ambitious, took the work, did the project, naive, didn't know better, was totally exploited. Later on, see a newsletter campaign, word for word, there's my stuff. So this is not a thing that happens to somebody else for me. This is something that I've experienced firsthand, so I get really fired up about it. I do not do any free labor, period. Yeah. I have invested a shit ton of time, money, and creative energy in making sure that my website accurately displays all the different types of services I offer. There's plenty of samples of similarly scoped projects for each line of business that I showcase. And I'm always happy to provide additional samples if something is a little bit more bespoke that they're interested in. That said, I will do test projects if they're paid, like the end period. Because of this. And I don't think that every hiring manager or marketing lead out there is like maniacally plotting to get free labor from new freelancers and to steal their work. But it does happen. And I also think that whether it gets used by the company or not, it sets a dangerous precedent. Like that in our profession, we do work for free to prove we're worth. Would you ask a plumber, a lawyer, a doctor, do this one freebie for me, and then I'm going to hire you? Like, no, we respect those professions and their credentials, and we read reviews, and we feel like it's on us to do our due diligence before we hire somebody. It doesn't always like work out perfectly, but yeah, it's a solid, just hard line no for me. What about you?
I've actually, I'm trying to think if I've been in this situation, and I don't think I have. I'll take that back. I was an unpaid intern when that was a thing. I think it still is, unfortunately. I know I have mad about that still, but I worked on a lot of paid client projects, and these were like big clients, like you'd know them.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was like, little intern Jamie just designing stuff for these huge companies, not getting paid. And those things ended up in like national campaigns. So yes, I have experienced this, and similar to this listener, just naive, like kind of thinking, oh, this is fine. And then when I saw it in real life, I was like, wait a second. And it takes that kind of learning experience of like, oh, hey, that's pretty fucked up. But yep. I think, I love that you said, like, I try to supply as many samples as I can, especially those that are applicable to the work that I'll be doing. And I think, in this case, if you're trying to pitch to agencies and, they're like, hey, we'd love for you to do this test project to make sure you can do it. I honestly, in that scenario, would just say, hey, I'm happy to do that. Here's what my hourly rate is, and you can pay me for that. And if they say no, then I'm like, okay, that's not my client then. And because it's just like, it's not guaranteed that A, you're going to work with them in the future, and that B, that they're not going to use your work. I think another alternate solution to that, if you are like, oh, I'm really, trying to get my foot in the door at this agency, whatever, is saying, do you have any sort of agreement that basically says I still own what I create? Yeah. And just posing that question. If they don't, you can say, okay, I have one here, you can sign this, or working with, a lawyer or whoever to create that. If you are pursuing kind of like freelancing with an agency route, just getting like the paperwork in order.
Exactly.
And that will set the tone too for the rest of the relationship, that like, hey, I have these boundaries. I also have my shit together, and I know what to look for. You're not going to pull one over on me.
No, I'm a professional.
Yeah. Yes, I'm a professional.
And what a great BS detector, because if you were to say to them, hey, I have this, form or contract that states that I own this property since I'm not being paid for it. And if they were to balk at that, bitch bye. Like, no, because that's going to tell you everything you need to know about how they're going to treat you and respect you and your intellectual property and your ideas and just your professional identity working with them. Like, no, thank you.
Yes.
Hard pass. And I actually have successfully, convinced, I guess, a prospective client when they wanted me to do like a massive amount of free spec work. I said, like, no, but I will provide this sample for you. And if you want, to pare this down, this is what it would cost to do this spec work. And I actually, then got them to pay me. And I've seen subsequent job postings from this agency since, and they are paying their freelancers. I'm not saying that like it's because of me, but I do think if more of us kind of band together and hold this line and hold this boundary and say like, no, we're not going to do this, if we are able to do so, I think it helps everybody. It helps everybody out.
Yeah. Well, and in a similar vein too, and I know I actually have a friend who listens that I can feel her screaming about this right now as I'm saying it into the microphone. She's a designer and she always talks about design contests. Yes, this is like in like art contests, that sort of thing. Like there are huge brands out there that need I remind you have way more money than you and I do, that are asking like, hey, submit this design for your chance to get it printed on our cans. What? Like, hello? So it's like like they could pay a legit artist to create a design that meets their brand, that, meets their vision, all of those things. But instead they're like, let's just see how many options we can get, and not pay anybody for it. And we'll pay you in free beer. Oh, thanks. Like,
I mean, I want the free beer in addition to being paid. Like that.
Yes.
That is the direction I would like to move.
Yes. That's the like value add for me. So
exactly.
I would say, and there's like a lot of platforms we talked about in the last episode, like Upwork, Fiverr, all of those things. Those like some of those platforms also perpetuate that spec work idea, like 99 designs. Oh, you can get all of these design options. Well, only one of those people gets picked and paid, and still the pay amount is probably pretty low. So I think it's just kind of like putting up your bullshit detector of, am I doing this free work? If so, who owns it? Do I own it? Yeah. Could I resell it? So yeah, just like kind of observing the culture of this, and as Liz said, like putting your foot down and being like, I'm not participating.
No. And as a client who needs design work or whatever the discipline might be, like, and you're participating in some of these exploitive models, maybe it's because you never thought about it this way and you've never been on the other side of it. But I would just really encourage you to think about long-term, like how you want to use your money, how you want the people that serve you and your business to be treated and respected. And if you're asking folks for free labor or participating in some of these models, and you can't do it otherwise, you can't afford to run your business. Sorry.
No.
So. Like you don't have a viable business model if you can't make it work without free labor. So just something to think about. We don't want to blame the victims of this system for the system, because we know the real reason it exists. So with that, I would love to move on to probably the meatiest question 3, which is all about scope creep. You ready?
I love scope creep. Not really,
we
though.
will never stop talking about this, although we hope to be able to one day, but that's a rather lofty goal. And before I dive into the question, I'm going to read a couple scope creep horror stories / comments. One listener says they deal with scope creep all the time. Mostly it has to do with rewrites, though, and they say they really need to stick firm to their 2 revision rule. I just want to say we're sending boundary vibes your way. Stick to those boundaries, stick to that rule, or you'll be banging your head against the wall. And this second horror story actually echoes a lot of a story that Jamie told on the podcast recently about nonprofit help. So listen to this. One client, a nonprofit group, is the worst about scope creep. They disguise the extra work they want as, quote, edits, even though it's clearly a rewrite. For example, just the other day, they asked me to write detailed outlines with sources for our next 3 blogs. They refused to provide topics or guidance. Love that. They simply said, quote, write about something current and relevant, whatever that means.
Write about the Titan sub.
Seriously, on it. When I submitted the outlines, they kicked back one of the 3 topics and called it, quote, fundamentally erroneous from the get-go, and asked me to totally scrap that topic and write a new outline. It's over an hour of work per outline, especially because they will only accept sources that are less than 12 months old.
Oh my
Still
gosh.
No topic guidance provided, so I'm back to the drawing and guessing board for that 3rd blog. And for the record, the topic was factually backed by several recent sources I provided. I believe they misread the title and automatically kicked it back without a full read.
Skimmers, man. I hate when people skim things, or it's like they respond to an email. You're like sending an email that's like, hey, here's some questions.
Yeah.
And they're like, yes. Or no.
So bad. And I want to just say to this listener, you aren't doing writing work. I mean, you are doing writing work, but you are absolutely doing strategy work, figuring out kind of the topics, the angle, the hook, and doing the research. And you might be in the water with this client right now, but moving forward, I just want to remind you that strategy is more expensive than production. So
you may be entitled to additional compensation.
You are. If you are doing this and you are doing both the strategy and execution, you are saving somebody a freaking headache and are doing an incredible lift for their product marketing or whatever it is they're doing. So, price
not to mention the
accordingly,
research too. The research,
yes.
especially with those parameters. Yeah, they should be paying you for that time as well.
Absolutely. I have heavy research requirements often because of the work I do in kind of the healthcare space, mental health space. And so I know what it's like to spend hours of your week sitting with primary sources and academic journals. As fun for nerds like myself as that can be, it's time consuming and expensive. So just want to gas you up a little bit on that front. And so let me get to this other listener's question, which is specifically about scope creep. Clearly, you are not alone. Here we go. I'm a content designer and my clients often have people working on the UI who claim to be UX designers, but don't actually do any UX work. I'm triggered. I have ended up doing everything from spearheading user interviews to challenging the visual hierarchy choices of the designer. I do press clients to hire the appropriate functions, but I can't afford to be choosy with the gigs I take at the moment. How do I prevent scope creep? Ooh. First, before you answer, Jamie, I just want to say, like, if you don't even know what UX or UI is, let me just break it down for you like this. This person is having to do things, very specialized things that are not what she or he was hired for. And so not only are they having to do the bulk of the work that is within their area of expertise, they're having to kind of push outside that because the client is not hiring appropriate talent. Am I saying that right, Jamie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree. I know. I have a lot of, this is triggering for me.
I could tell.
Because it's giving like when you sit down at a table in an office with like a bunch of CEOs and you're like, oh, you guys are all idiots. That's what this is giving. And you just realize like, oh, they've just made the right moves to get in the positions that they're in. It's triggering for me. But, and I think, so the bulk of this question is how do I prevent scope creep? But I'd like to like go back a step and put it back on you to say, how do you stay in your lane instead? And basically just put the boundary up and say like, hey, this is not my job to advise on UX UI design. In fact, I'm a writer. I'm not the person to be doing this. You've hired these people in these positions. I'm kind of questioning if they are qualified, just in my, little narrow knowledge. It seems like they're missing some core functionality, that sort of thing. And just say, and leaving it at that, just to stay in your lane, to not let the scope creep happen and basically just say like, not my job.
It's so hard though. It's so hard. This would be like, let's say, you install tile for a living, and in order to install a new tile shower in someone's bathroom, somebody else has to build out the framing, get it all set up so that you have like a plumb surface to adhere tile to, right? But let's say that the person that the client hired before you did that, like all the walls are crooked, nothing is plumb or straight, there's water leaking through, and you're like, well, I can't affix tile to this because if I do, it's going to look like absolute shit, and then people will think I'm a shitty tile setter, right? So what do you do? And this is really tough because I've been in these situations where I'm handed, an outline, a wireframe, just a concept or an idea, and for me to try to run with it, I know it's not going to work out, and so I feel almost like pressured, like this listener did, to step in and be like, hey, like this isn't going to work. If I do this for you, like this has to all be corrected. But then what do you do if the person to do the correcting, if it's not you, like isn't available? It, can't fix it, doesn't know how to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that analogy is really great and does put it into a different perspective for me, where it's like, yeah, I physically can't do my job without these things. Yeah, it is interesting to think about it in different terms than like my actual work.
Well, yeah, and one of the not sneaky, but like one of the ways I kind of like scratch at this in the discovery process is I always asked what the person or agencies or startups, whatever it is, what their experience is working with contractors like myself. Because I want to know how much support they're going to need in understanding how we can do great work together. I don't expect that knowledge to be baked in if I'm their first contract hire or specialist hire, right? But it does give me a little insight into like, oh yeah, we work with people all the time. We have all this cross-functional like framework built into what we do. When we onboard you, you'll get these documents and you'll talk to this person. That's how you'll get welcomed in the project. I'm like, cool. They understand how all these moving parts work together. But if there's crickets in response to that question, that can be a little telling that maybe something like this could be like lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, I think something I'm a big proponent of, and I'm curious what you think about this too, is like freelancers accessibility to other freelancers within the organization. So you can have these conversations that, you know, you want to push back on this thing and say like, hey, this doesn't work with what I was told to do or what I've been tasked with doing. How can we kind of come to a common ground or remedy this? And if the client is like, no, you only talk to me, you cannot talk to other people on the project, like that's a red flag for me that it's like, oh, what's going on here? So yeah, I'm curious what you think about that. I know you've worked with other freelancers, and sometimes it also opens its own can of worms.
It can, which actually we'll get to in another question that I think will kind of round that out nicely. But I do think this tough situation is not completely avoidable. You can kind of try to do your vetting and your due diligence and ask these questions ahead of time. But when you're stuck in it, I think you only have a few options. You do like the best you can to stay in your lane and finish up the project and pray to God that they don't reference you in anything that would link you to the work. Never put that shit in your portfolio and keep it moving. 2, you just have like a really honest conversation with whoever your kind of like primary contact is and say, this is what's happening. I'm raising this issue because I care about the success of the project and this team and this work. And I think we all want the same thing. Find the common ground and assume positive intent, right?
Yeah.
And then just be really honest. Like, I want to do this level of work. And in order for me to do that for you, which is what you're paying me for and what you deserve, here is what I need, whether that's more clear definition, more communication, outside support, a different specialist, and then be very clear about what the limits are of what you can do if that's not addressed, and give them the opportunity to make it right. And I don't think that as freelancers, we have the ability to like shape the internal systems of these teams that we are kind of pushing into from the outside. But I think it's at least worth one conversation. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely worth the conversation. And it's kind of going back to that idea of if you feel like you're doing bad work, like if you feel like you're wasting the client's money, you're wasting your time. And so just being really transparent about that too, as far as like if you're doing copywriting on this project, for example, it's like, hey, you're paying me X amount of money. And because of these things, my work is going to not really matter, or it's not going to do what it should do. Like this is a waste of your money. It is finding that common ground. Like we both want the same thing. We want this project to be successful. We want this to grow your business or whatever. And this is not the way to do that. Again, though, going back to Liz's earlier comment about you're doing the strategy work. Like if you start to get into this territory, you're doing the strategy work, and you're also doing like people management work, which it doesn't sound like you were hired to do. So I don't know that you can go back and say like, hey, and now you owe me for this time. But moving forward, if you know you have a tendency to kind of want to push back, do more, charge for that, like put that into your price. I know I can do that. Like I I've said this before, but I'm like very type A and feel like if I see something that could be fixed, I'm like, oh, just let me in there and let me fix it. And so I know I'm going to spend extra time doing those things. So I put that in the price.
Yeah.
Knowing I'm going to.
Yep. Charge for
kind of
audit.
like, yeah. And like knowing scope creep is going to happen a lot of times too. That's like pad your pricing, knowing scope creep is going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then great. You still made a little more money.
And it's not scope creep, in my opinion. It's not scope creep for you to share an insight or an observation with a client that might not be directly related to your input on the project, but that would ultimately support the project as a whole. Like, for example, if I'm doing, like you said, copywriting on a project, but I realize that the visuals for the user journey from like lead magnet to website to email communication is all over the place and really disjointed, I feel totally comfortable saying to clients, like, I know I'm focusing on the copy side of this right now, but I notice some inconsistency with XYZ that might create some friction for your users. Just wanted to toss that out there. I know that's not something that's, within my scope or to fix, but I really want this copy that I'm creating to be as effective as possible in us meeting our goals. And that's really part of it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes pointing those things out too can be to your benefit in the long run, where it is like if you do those things or you can make those fixes, it opens up the table for more work in the future. So like when you wrap this up, you can say like, hey, and I know we talked about this issue. I would love to jump in and help with that. Like, this is what that would look like. Let me know if you want to move forward. So I think it's kind of the, almost the yes and approach that we've talked about before.
Maybe that's not in the budget to address right now, but just know that if we continue to work together, I would be so happy to collaborate with your designer so that we can make sure that consistency is built in on both ends. I mean, that makes clients feel taken care of, right? Because they want that consistency. They want that wraparound support where everybody who's kind of on their team is supporting them. So there's, I think, a delicate way to point out these challenges without offering to be the one to fix it because it's not your lane, but offering in future iterations of a contract, other scopes of work, offering to be that person who's kind of the bridge between these stakeholders, someone that will collaborate effectively with those other people. I think that provides a lot of value and shows that you're a professional who actually cares about the work.
Yeah. So much of that comes down to tact too. Like not saying, hey, this UX designer is not a UX designer. Like not saying that, but saying like, hey, on previous projects I've worked on, this solution hasn't really worked. I'm wondering if this approach might be better. Just kind of posing those things, not calling people out and being like the freelance police. Like this person isn't doing what they're supposed to. But instead just like posing other options, and maybe they have more information that you don't too. And they're like, oh, the reason we did this is because our scope of work says this. Like you might not know their scope. So it's kind of like a very nuanced situation that I don't feel like is a clear answer. And I feel like this scenario could happen in so many different ways with so many different clients.
Yep. It really can, and it probably will. And it's just up to all of us to figure out the best ways we can to prevent it and then make the best of either a clean exit or different working model when it happens.
Okay, Liz, we've got one more question that I'm very excited to dive into. But first, we've got a horror story. And if you are loving these questions, please stay tuned. We are going to continue to answer your questions, share your horror stories, even in our downtime. So just stay tuned for more details on that. But let's dive into this horror story. So I was a contract event marketer and had a client ask if I could just help find some speakers for their event. Whoa. No big deal. A couple hours, maybe. Suddenly, it turned into building and managing a 24-hour event. Between that and my other clients, I billed 250 hours that much. No. Between that and my other clients, I billed 250 hours that month, even with getting help.
We're both speechless. Listener, you've officially made Jamie and Liz speechless. Congratulations. This is so bad. This is terrible.
I know. Oh my gosh. This is like going back to the scope creep question. It's like when you say yes to the little thing, And then it turns into a big thing and you're like, damn it. I knew better. And
I don't
but at least you got to bill for the time though. Like that's
True.
the silver lining, but billing 250 hours for one client in 1 month is one way ticket to burnout.
Yeah, like how much hair did you have left after this? If at all. And I don't work in events, but I can imagine like the undercurrent and the momentum of something like that is happening live is so much more difficult to back away from once it's in motion and to set those boundaries once things escalate. So, oh my God, listener, I feel for you. I cannot even imagine.
Yes. And it sounds like 24-hour event. It sounds like maybe early pandemic days when we were all like just scraping by and like pulling our hair out anyway. So thoughts and prayers for you, listener, in your recovery.
Yes, we're thinking of you. And we'd love to hear from you in the future if maybe you figured out some ways to manage some of this stuff if you're still in the event game. Unbelievable.
Yes. Okay. So jumping into our question. So this is all about balancing financial security while also learning to say no. So we've talked about that and like boundaries, barriers, all of those things. And sometimes we take on the work that we don't necessarily want to do or shouldn't necessarily do because at the end of the day, we need a paycheck. So let's dive in. When I first started consulting, I said yes to everything. I was so worried about financial security that I didn't want to turn down any work, even when there were some red flags with a client or a misalignment on the work that they were asking me to do. What are some tips on striking that balance at the beginning of having enough work, but not taking on bad clients? Let me read that last sentence again. What are some tips on striking that balance at the beginning of your career of having enough work, but not taking on bad clients? Liz, we've both been at the beginning.
I've been there. I have so been there. And sometimes you don't know that it's going to be a nightmare until you're in it, which comes back to like what you were saying about all these other discussions we've had about lead qualification and building things into your process and your marketing to kind of vet out people who might suck, and draw the great people to you, which is a bit of a complicated dance sometimes. I think a couple of things come to mind is when you think about your leads, instead of it being like a hard yes and a hard no, framing your willingness to take on a project with like a yes, no, maybe approach. Like the yes is being like, I would do this work for free if I didn't have bills. I love it so much. No being like, this violates like my personal code of ethics. I would be a disaster in this role and shouldn't do the work. Like anything that's like hard, hell no. But leaving room for that middle ground, which is maybe like, oh, this is boring. Oh, this is tedious. This doesn't light me up in any ways, but it pays the bills and it's fine. And then 2, giving yourself permission to embrace work that is just fine sometimes. And realizing
not everything is a portfolio piece.
No, or a passion project or a big money maker. Listen, we all have to keep ourselves and our families fed. And we talk a lot about bringing your true self to your work and your values to your work. You can still do that and still take on projects that are kind of like the meh projects sometimes. I do.
Yeah.
I've had them throughout every year of business, and I will continue to. And it doesn't mean that they're bad projects or that the work's going to be shitty. It's just not something that you're going to like want to shout about from the rooftops, and that's okay. Being in a position to be more choosy about work is a real privilege. To be in a position where you can be like, either it lights me up and pays me $1 million, or I'm not getting out of bed. Like, we would all love to be there, but that is not real life for most people. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think one strength that I see in your business approach, Jamie, is your ability to kind of orient yourself to your work in a way that means that you don't like assign your personal value with what you do with your work. Like you have really like, I have to work on those boundaries. I'm a little bit in the gray on that because I am so like fiery about so much of what I do. But like, if you take on a meh project, you're not a meh person, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I struggle with that too, though. I mean, that's like that, how we were raised, going back to the very first episode, like your value is tied to like your work and how much you contribute. That is a very common idea in our culture.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to say too, like I love all the people I work with, and I think that is my number one priority. Even if the work is kind of like meh and it's not sexy and it's not going to be something I like that's in my portfolio, if I can get along with the person and enjoy like having conversations with them and kind of solving problems with them, those are the things that are like the maybe zone for me, where it's like the work's not great, but the relationship is, the pay is good. It's what I need right now. It's also like what you need right now is not maybe what you need in 3 months. It's probably not what you needed 3 months ago either. So kind of embracing those waves. I think it's like, there's two different things here too. There's the red flags in the client, and you know, if those are the things like Liz said that are like violating your code of ethics, those sort of things, those are like immediate no's. But then like the misalignment. Well, sometimes for me anyway, in my business, misalignment on the front end might just be that the client doesn't really know what they need or what they want. And it's like, if you pitch your thing and they're like, oh, you're right, does that align you? So can you get to a place of alignment, I think too. So it's definitely like also knowing what you need. Like, is this paycheck and this kind of headache that I know is going to ensue? I mean, sometimes I've taken on work that I'm like, the pay is good, but damn it, if this does not hurt my soul in some way. But the like, oh shit, I forgot what to say. What was I saying? Okay, sorry. So sometimes knowing what you need is the most important thing here. It's like, do you need money more than you need free time right now? Do you need free time more than you need money? Like, what are those things? And recognizing that in yourself to be able to say, right now I'm in a position where I can and should say no to this, or right now I'm in a position where I can and should say yes to this. Even if it does bend that, or it gives me a headache, or it like stresses me out, it's temporary. I have to remember that sometimes too. Like, this is the temporary project that will be done in like a month. Let's just get through it to pay the bills. I do that sometimes, you know? It's not all fun and games over here.
Same. I can't tell you how many freelancers, consultants that I admire that are super seasoned and I've talked to lately, and they're applying for full-time work right now. And admittedly having a hard time with that because so much of their ethos is about being this solopreneur, right? Like, it's a part of who they are and really connected to their identity. But the economy is going to economy. Like, the reality of our marketplace right now, especially in creative fields adjacent to tech, things are not looking good, and there's all types of upheaval. So there's really no shame in doing what you have to do for yourself, whether that's taking a client that's not the most inspiring or might even just be a pain in the ass for a while to pay your bills, whether that's taking a breather from freelance and going W-2 for a little while until things stabilize. It doesn't mean you can never escape the hellscape again and go back to working for yourself. And it's just okay to pivot. It's okay to pivot, and your value as a human and as a contributor is not just your output.
Yeah. I don't know if I've shared this on the show, but many years ago I ran a cookie company that was a cookie pop-up. And it was super fun. I loved it. But then I got to a point where I did not love it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so burnt out. I hate cookies. I never want to touch an oven again. Like, I hate this. And I really had to come to terms with like, what does this mean for me if I quit doing this? Because so much of my like being was tied up in my work like that. And like really reckoning with, it doesn't mean that I'm a failure if I choose to quit doing this. It means that I'm listening to myself and taking what I need and acknowledging, oh shit, Jamie, you are burned out. You need a break. Does it mean it's gone forever?
Right.
Maybe not. I always try to, when I do like say no to something or close a door on something, it's not really closing a door as much as it's like leaving it ajar and saying, maybe later.
Maybe later.
Maybe later. Yeah. Or maybe right now,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, getting to a place where you can't look at cookies.
Right. What is that life?
I can't imagine. I don't think I will ever experience that frame of mind. I want all the cookies all the time, but that's just such a good example of something you love becoming something you don't love and having to make those hard choices that we all have to navigate at some point, especially if we're doing the solo thing.
Yes. Yeah. And knowing who you are deep down, even if you take on the work that maybe doesn't feel like 100% you, you know who you are still.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Jamie. Well, we are about out of time for today, and that bums me out because we did not get through all of those great listener questions. But rest assured, we are going to be tackling those and sharing answers and responses and thoughts with you during our brief hiatus. And before we sign off, this is just a pause. This is not goodbye. But we want to let you guys know how you can keep in touch with us during our brief hiatus as we gear up and do some planning to come back for season 2. We're going to be sharing teasers and tidbits you may have missed during this season. So don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Scope Creep Show. You can find Jamie at JMER Cox and Liz at LIZTALAGO. If you have a topic you'd love for us to discuss or a question you want answered, you can email us at scopecreepshow@gmail.com. And as always, if you loved season 1 of Scope Creep, please leave us a 5-star review. And if you didn't love us, then please leave. And until next time and season 2, stay creepy.